Hello, it is an honor to welcome you here today to the 21st Bookfest Festival du Livre Windsor, and to this discussion about the new book, The Fire That Time, Transnational Black Radicalism and the Sir George Williams Occupation. My name is Irene Moore-Davis, and I am the Bookfest Festival du Livre Windsor Programming Chair. Before we get started with today's program and all of our work, it is important for us to share this land acknowledgement about the place from which we're hosting this event. Literary Arts Windsor acknowledges that our organization and the festival are based on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. We respect the longstanding relationships with First Nations people in this place in the 100-mile Windsor-Essex Peninsula and the Straits, Les Détroits of Detroit. We are so proud to have continued to bring this wonderful annual Festival of Literary Arts to Windsor, Essex County without interruption for over 20 years. Our charitable organization, Literary Arts Windsor, particularly wants to recognize Canadian Heritage, Ontario Arts Council, Canada Council for the Arts, the University of Windsor, our major sponsors for helping to make these events possible. And I would now like to introduce you to our moderator for this event, Dr. Andrew Allen of the University of Windsor.
Thank you, Irene. Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here, and it is a privilege to be in conversation with our panelists. Again, my name is Andrew Allen, and I will be speaking with Ronald Cummings and Nalini Mohabir. So the book they have co-authors is called The Fire That Time, the Transnational Black Radicalism and the Sir George Williams Occupation. So welcome, Nalini and Ronald. Before we begin our conversation, I will ask our authors to each offer a short reading or select passages from the book. So.
Thank you. Maybe I'll go first because I'd like to read you the foreword to our book. The foreword was written by our dear friend Kai Kello, who was awarded the Griffin Prize for Poetry for his book Magnetic Equator. He's also written about the Sir George Williams occupation in his book Dominoes at the Crossroads, and has captured the spirit of student protests in his previous novel Accordion. And the reason I've chosen to start with his words and not ours is because I think his foreword really captures the vision for what we were trying to do. So I'll begin. In Montreal's Black history, we encountered two major incidents that were marked by fire. The more recent fire burned 50 years ago in 1969, when Black Caribbean students and their allies occupied the 9th floor computer center at Sir George Williams University, now Concordia University. The occupation was carried out in protest against racial bias in grading, a bias exasperated by the administration's negligent response to student complaints. The more distant fire was allegedly lit by Marie-Joseph Angelique, an enslaved woman in 1734. That fire, perhaps a response to bondage and exploitation, may have been kindled by a desire for freedom that accompanied her from Madeira, Portugal, to New England and eventually to New France, into whose territory she was sold in 1725. Her fire burnt down much of Montreal's port. This year marks the 285th anniversary of her death and the 50th anniversary of the Sir George Williams student occupation. So he was writing in 2019. Caribbean history is animated by the figures of Nani, Bassa, Toussaint, Kafi, Kwamina, Akraba, and others who led and participated in uprisings against the plantation slave system, people who were considered, as Angelique was, to be enemies of the state, rebels, yet who came to be seen as the founders of independent nations. These figures are now national heroes. While nationalism may commandeer the symbols and narratives of freedom, they do not own the drive for freedom, respect, and self-determination. These properties trespass upon borders, span oceans, and sweep across centuries. When I think about this, I cannot avoid considering whether, if Montreal was an island in the Caribbean, Marie-Joseph Angelique would be considered a national hero. Then again, the point of her fire, of our fire, is that it is hypothetical. It blazes with or without promises, official acknowledgements, titles, and honors. It does not require crowns or flags, medals of honor, uniforms, titles, and other accoutrements. Fire is a force we have carried with us since our arrival on these shores, and which we continue to carry. While both events, the 1734 fire and the 1969 occupation, are unique, I would urge everyone to think of each one less as its own self-contained occurrence and more as part of a tradition, part of a continuous fire. It is a fire that begets dub poetry and roots in rebel music, work that thinks about how to be, how to survive, how to live with a world that is exploitative and oppressive, and how to transform it. But these traditions are more than that. Dub poetry speaks back in defiance, and in doing so fortifies the self and community. By speaking out, as the students did in 1969, by speaking up for ourselves, we transform the world on an elemental level, the level of language, thought, communication, understanding, and possibility. We ignite possibility. Again, that's Kai Kello's words in the foreword to The Fire That Time.
I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction to the book that Nalini and I co-authored. I want to say thanks to Literary Arts Windsor for the invitation to have this dialogue as part of this book festival. So I'm reading from the introduction, which is titled The Fire That Time. After 2 weeks, on February 11th, 1969, riot police were summoned by the university administration to end the matter. The staircases and escalators were barricaded with furniture to protect from siege, while police encircled the building. The police entered, some with guns drawn, according to one first-hand account. A fire quickly ensued, ripping through the computer center, destroying it beyond recognition. The fire placed the lives of the occupying students at risk, although what was most frequently reported was the estimated $2 million property damage. Smoke from the hall building drew a crowd of white Montrealers who gathered to see the students arrested and shouted racist slurs at those who had escaped the fire, as memorialized in the title of Dennis Forsyth's 1971 edited volume on the event. Several students reported severe beatings or torture by police. Following the arrest of 97 students, the student protest took on national and international proportions. Eric Williams, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, through the High Commission, paid students' lawyers' fees and fines. Politicians who had previously viewed educational opportunities for international students as part of Canada's support to the Third World now called for the students' deportation. The RCMP systematically searched the hall building, monitored entry points, checked IDs, and shut down the offices of the student newspaper, The Georgian. Protesters fell under suspicion as Black Power activists or other rabble-rousers, and some were subject to state surveillance. 5 years after the crisis, through a merger and academic rebranding, Sir George Williams University became the downtown campus of the newly named Concordia University. Dennis Forsyth, a Jamaican scholar studying and teaching sociology in Montreal at the time of the crisis, countered the tendency to view this event solely as a localized incident and scaled up the protest to situate it within a wider context of resistance to Canadian imperialist relations towards the Caribbean. Canada held a relatively privileged place within the British Empire as a white settler colony, whereas the Caribbean were plantation colonies built to extract labor and profits, including by Canadian proxies of empire. Redpath Sugar Refinery in Montreal, for instance, began by importing sugar from the British West Indies. As we argue, the inferno that ended the student occupation of the university's computer center placed Montreal and the Caribbean not only within long-standing colonial relationships, but also within a broader geography of Black resistance. Events in late 1960s Montreal had significant transnational implications. Guyanese historian Walter Rodney was expelled from Jamaica after attending the Congress of Black Writers in Montreal, leading to the so-called Rodney riots in 1968, with protests against the Jamaican government's decision to ban Rodney, headed by students at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. Following the arrest of the Sir George Williams student protesters, the next year, students in Trinidad at the University of the West Indies mobilized into the National Joint Action Committee to support students in Montreal and protest against Canadian interests in Trinidad, such as the predominantly Canadian local banks, which hired only white or near white employees. Students in Trinidad and Barbados also protested against Canada's Governor General, Roland Michener, who was on a goodwill tour in the fashion of royal visits to the region, largely symbolic. It is this geography of intertwined resistance and resistant knowledge that we wish to theorize here, mapped through fire and through a concept of transnational Black radicalism.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, when I was reading this, what I loved most about your book is the engaging and captivating writing style. I just did not want to put the book down. And I have so many other things that I wanted to do when I started reading. I was talking to Nalini before we started and realized there's some connections there. I went to Toronto Metropolitan University. At that time, it was Ryerson, and IBM mainframes and punch cards. So in frustration, I've thrown my whole box of punch cards in the air. So the image of the punch cards flying resonated with me. And also when my sister, Canadian dub poet Lillian Allen, was mentioned, and I found a quote from her where she talks about your book, and she says, "At last, a pivotal moment in the Canadian grassroots Black activism and transnational Black radicalism, rooted within student response to the alarming racism at Sir George Williams University, now Concordia, incisively noted, captured, and discussed for generations to come." So for those of us, or those probably who aren't familiar, can you please describe the Sir George Williams occupation? What was that like?
I guess maybe I'll go and Ronald will
Yes.
jump in. So in 1969, there were a number of international students from the Caribbean at Sir George Williams University at Concordia. In fact, it was seen as this university that was welcoming to a diverse group of students, to students who were low income, to students who were immigrants, to students who were racialized, and so on, sort of the alternative to McGill. And these students who were attending Sir George, as you know, Andrew, that in that period to come to Canada for education meant that you most likely were the best and brightest. You were selected, you received scholarships, you had, the support of a village, a family behind you. There was great expectations placed on you. And those students that were here, many of them intended to study medicine, and they needed a required course in physiology that was taught by Professor Perry Anderson at Sir George Williams University. And as Rodney John, one of the original complainants, tells us, there was messages passed from Caribbean students to Caribbean students. So he heard it from a Syrian Caribbean student that this professor would fail all his Caribbean students. And then of course that message carried. So the students decided to test it out by exchanging answers to a test with white students who used the Caribbean students' answers and passed the test with flying colors. But when the Caribbean students gave those answers, they were failed. So they complained to the administration in '68. And then the summer break happened, and essentially this was became a protracted dispute that could have been solved rather easily, but it was not by the administration, who maybe at the time were caught up in a kind of idea of Canada in a developmentalist kind of way, helping, the developing global South, so could not see themselves as actually committing a wrongdoing because they saw themselves as benevolent. And so because the students weren't getting anywhere, what was potentially a minor dispute grew. And the students, in that spirit of the 1960s, where we saw student protests from around the world, they refused. They said no. And they did that by occupying the 9th floor of the hall building, this building that I'm currently sitting in. They occupied the computer center, which was filled with gigantic IBM mainframe computers from the 1960s. And they did that for 2 weeks until the administration called the police on them. And then the Montreal riot police showed up. There was a fire set. We don't know by who. The students were blamed. But if you read their accounts of it, they were trapped in the computer center by the fire and had to hack their way out with an emergency axe. So clearly, their lives were threatened. And then they were arrested by the waiting police, and almost 100 students were arrested in the process and subject to police violence. And one of the students, Corey Lee Hutchinson, died allegedly as a result of a baton blow to the head.
Wow.
And just to add to that, in terms of thinking about what the Sir George Williams University protest is, I think it's important that we not only understand it as a localized event. There were these group of students who made this complaint, and the university failed to address it in a timely way. However, I think what's interesting are the sort of transnational ripples from this. So in the wake of the protests, as we mentioned in the passage I just read, the government of Trinidad became involved. But also we should understand that, this was being covered in newspapers in Jamaica, in the US, it was in the New York Times. So there were sort of international repercussions and ripples around this. And I think for us, it remains fascinating that it has kind of disappeared from Canadian consciousness because it was such a heavily mediatized event at the time. In putting this book together, we were interested in thinking about that transnational scope and thinking about the ways in which, this was a kind of this centered on international students who had come to Canada to study. And therefore, there is a way in which we should approach the telling of the story in a way that considers the transnational and international repercussions of this.
And sorry, just to add as well, it directly led to the Black Power Revolution in Trinidad as well, because the students at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad were also protesting, as Ronald had mentioned, protesting, for example, the Canadian Governor General's visit in support of their colleagues in Montreal. And, we might even see resonances beyond the immediate and direct connections to the student protests in Jamaica. I believe it was the Creative Arts Center in 1970, perhaps to the Grenadian Revolution, and to the current moment of BLM. I think when we're discussing transnational Black radicalism, we're thinking about the ripples both in space and time.
Yeah, when I was reading this, and you spoke about those heroes, like for example, Nanny and Nanny of the Maroons in Jamaica. All my public schooling was in Jamaica, and we learned about all the rebellions. And so for us, it was a part of our history that there were constant rebellions and there was pushback. So I'm getting a sense that the motivation for writing this and the idea for this book is for restoration and to kind of bring back like the histories that are missing. Was that kind of part of the motivation, and to tells stories of that are, and also stories that are missing about fighting back and rebelling.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that you start there to sort of think about the kinds of Caribbean histories we've inherited, because the students who were coming to Montreal brought those histories with them. You know, they understood this history of struggle, this history of resistance to colonialism and racism. And so, you know, when they encountered, you know, these moments of discrimination, you know, you know, their instinct was to fight back because, you know, they understood this tradition of resistance. And so we wanted to, we wanted to tell this story because you know, it's a story that I think has disappeared from public consciousness in a particular way. And to say that is not to say that it's a story that, you know, that has disappeared. It's interesting to think about the places where it's being told. So when we started to do the research around this, you know, we would tell people that, oh, we're interested in doing some work on the Sir George Williams University protest. And, you know, you'd be surprised the number of times people would say, oh, you know, my cousin told me about this, or my uncle told me about this. You know, so there are ways in which the story has been kept and circulated within Black communities in Canada, within families and communities in the Caribbean. But there's a way in which it has disappeared from a national consciousness. You know, and the reasons for that are multiple. I mean, you know, we can think about the sort of the ways in which national histories, you know, are constructed in particular ways, right? So, you know, that these were international students. There are ways in which it's easy to excavate them from a sort of situated national narrative. You know, because they're transnational subjects, right? But we wanted to sort of like think about the complexities of their stories, and to kind of, and also I want to say that, you know, they're still around. The protesters are still around. And one of the really beautiful things was that we were able to have conversations with them and capture some of their firsthand memories of the protests and the aftermaths of the protest. So we opened the book actually with a dialogue, a conversation between a number of the protesters who were there in 1969. So I think part of the impetus for this was to recuperate this history, but not in a kind of disembodied way, but to think about it at different scales. So to think about it at the personal, at the national, at the transnational levels, and to try to think about, you know, why this history matters.
And so,
oh, sorry.
oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I just wanted to quickly add, I guess, you know, because I'm based in Montreal, that in thinking about the nation, there's also Quebec to think about, and there's a kind of singularity of understanding the rebellious history of protest in the province that seems to leave out this quite momentous event that exceeds Quebec. And I also just wanted to add that in thinking, we weren't just recuperating a history that maybe has not been fully documented, even, you know, despite our best efforts, but we're as Caribbean people, Ronald and myself, have a practice of thinking with others. That's something that we think is important, to listen to our elders, to, you know, to take that time to gather up the writings and the stray notes, the documents, to recognize the stories that haven't been told, to you know, to know that we maybe have, because we're, you know, as professors in the university, maybe we have been able to enter these institutions more quietly than they have, but that doesn't mean that we need to stay quiet, that we have, a responsibility to the shoulders that we stand on. And we do that through recognizing that we're part of a community and recognizing the caring relationships of listening to the generations that came before us as part of our mode of putting together the book.
So I'm curious about what guided you in selecting the essays that you chose?
I think I'll let Ronald take that one.
Well, some of this work started in community and in dialogue. So the book grew out of a conference we held in 2019 on the 50th anniversary of the protest. And what we did on that occasion was that we had 2 weeks of events to mark the time of the protest, because the students occupied the university for 2 weeks. And so there were, we did that, and, we had lots of conversations across those 2 weeks. And that motivated us to think about, what other ways could we tell this story? And the book became one way of doing that. So some of the things that appear in the book come out of that, but we were also conscious of thinking in community, and so there are a range of voices here, but also a range of ways of telling the story. So there are interviews with the protesters, there are transcribed conversations, there's memoirist prose. People, telling their stories firsthand. There are critical essays. There are essays that think about archives and how we can recover these stories from archives, how we can think with archives. There are essays which are interested in thinking about not just the history in a broad way, but also the specificities of the story. So thinking about women's place within the protest and within movements of the 1960s. So for us, it's a chorus of voices, that sit within these covers. And I do want to say that Nalini read Kai Kalau's preface to the work, but we also opened the volume with a poem by Kai. And we felt it was important to do this because in 1969, the students also understood poetry as part of their protests, poetry as part of their revolution, poetry as part of the way in which they spoke back to power. So, Claude McKay's poem, If We Must Die, was something that they reproduced in their communities as a sort of motivating source, right? To help them mobilize the struggle at that moment. So for us, it was important to open this book with poetry as a sort of homage to, the ways in which they organized their own modes of protest and their own modes of articulation.
I just wanted to add that it was just an incredible moment in 2019 to have the community gathered, including the original protesters, to have people from across generations. And there were stories told that maybe, we wouldn't have had in a different kind of more formal environment. So just to give you an example of some of the stories that we've captured in the book, in the chapter by Amanda Perry, she interviews Philippe Fizami, who was one of the protesters, not a student at the time, but a Haitian radical in exile in Montreal. And he was one of the protesters arrested. And he shares this incredible story of being brought into the courtroom. And as he's being brought into the courtroom, he carries a box which is wrapped like a gift to give to the bailiff. And inside the box is a voodoo doll. And it's interpreted as as a challenge to the court, and panic ensues, and it's just a really funny story that he shares with us. So there are these moments of where you see like the brazenness of the students coming through.
Yeah, I love that story. I noticed in your readings, both of you went back to fire and flame, that it's a constant theme and very symbolic throughout the whole book. And you center fire and/or flame as historically significant and to describe resistance and fighting back, and use it to describe that crucial moment of transnational Black radicalism, and how that connected North America, Britain, the Caribbean, and even Africa. So can you say a little bit more about the metaphor and the materiality of fire as represented in the book?
I can go. It was interesting, for instance, writing our introduction together. Nalini is a geographer. So when we talk about geographies of fire, she's interested in that kind of mapping, right? I'm a literary scholar, so I'm also interested in the symbolic and the metaphoric power of fire as and the ways in which it's been used in Black diasporic literature. So it was interesting coming together, right, to think about fire both in material terms, but also in symbolic terms. And I hope that comes through in terms of, just a kind of dynamic way of grappling with this question. But it's there through Black diaspora history. It's there in Montreal history. It's there in Caribbean history, and so there are ways in which there is this long history of fire, which is in the background or the foreground of what happens in 1969, right? So there's that element to it. But there's also the real intangible thing that the causes of the fire are still unknown. And I think when we had the events in 1969, in 2019, one of the keynote speakers, who was Michael West, called for an inquiry into what happened in 1969, right? Kind of that work of setting history straight. And so the fire as a question is a sort of central part of the story. But also at the same time, for us, we're really interested in the sort of symbolic resonances and how that connects different spaces within Black diaspora resistant geographies.
And I think that, Ronald, I can't quite remember the phrase, but I think it was something to the effect of departures, dissent, and divergences that you use in the introduction. And that's what fire allows us to see, right? It depends on your perspective, what you take away from it. So one of the commenters, who was a professor at the time, refers to the nihilistic perversions of the student, because he maybe viewed the fire or the students' activism as a kind of anarchic energy to just burn it all down. But the students themselves had a vision. They weren't just tearing things down or without purpose, right? They were thinking about, what does the vision mean to start anew? What does, because it was in the post-independence period, what does liberation look like? What is the transformative potential of fire?
Yeah.
Or fire as an energy and a pulse, metaphorically speaking.
And also, I think it's obvious that we were influenced in our thinking by James Baldwin in his book, The Fire Next Time, our title riffs on that, to also think about the 1960s, right? Like as a moment where, folks are thinking through these questions. And Baldwin, becomes a forceful space for thinking about, the threat, the potential, the uses of fire, within Black resistant geographies.
And I love the way that you describe fire as agency, fire as resistance, fire as change. And also, again, another imagery for me, because I was born in Spanish Town, Jamaica, and we're surrounded by a cane field, a sugarcane field, and any which way you throw, any which way you look. And the burning, that's that image that you paint of the burning of the cane fields, that was a part that we knew the sugarcane harvest, but in order to get sugar, you have to burn the cane fields. So that just resonated with me when I was reading the books. I don't know if that was your intent, but I got that. At this point, I would like to invite you both, or if you would like to read another passage for us before I go on to other questions. I don't know if you're prepared for that.
I just wanted to just say, like, thank you for your comment about, in memory of the cane fields. I think one of the things we were trying to do, and as we were writing the introduction, we were also reading Audre Lorde,
Yes.
And her chapter on learning from the 60s and Sister Outsider. And one of the things she says is that we need to find the necessary ingredients from the past that can energize our present and our futures. And, it was also that kind of landscape for us as well.
Well, selfishly, I felt like you were writing it to me, and you were making those connections, because I was getting excited. I'm like, yeah, this is what I grew up with. And it's leaving Jamaica and coming to Canada that I look back now and realize, oh yeah, we overcultivated sugarcane, and we were so immersed in the sugarcane harvest. I remember the ashes falling from the sky like snow, and so all the imagery that you painted, just I was so lost in the book. So thank you for that.
Oh, that's so kind of you to say. And maybe Ronald, if you don't mind, could I read first? Just because I think the section that I chose for the second reading kind of builds on what you've just said.
Sure.
Thank you. So this is from our co-authored introduction. Canada is often imagined outside of network geographies of the plantation system. Indeed, if as we have argued here, these geographies are marked by associations with fire, then Canada's quintessential imaginative and literary construction as a land of snow articulates an opposite geography. Associations of the Great White North with purity and untouched land, a product of the settler colonial imagination of frontiers, or a winter wonder landscape of leisure pursuits such as skiing, hockey, and skating, are all far distant from the histories of tropical laboring bodies. This geographical imagination is both a deliberate separation and erasure of connections. Under colonial rule, one of the notions perpetuated by Western ontologies was that Western geography, temperate climate, flora, fauna, land use, etc., was meaningful to all, such as in marking time through 4 seasons. Kamau Brathwaite foregrounded the insidious nature of colonial pedagogies, which lingered in the Caribbean even after independence. School children in the Caribbean were taught about snow through imported books rather than about the surrounding local environment and landscape. Brathwaite shares a creative way in which one child reconciled this foreign geographic imaginary and made it her own. A schoolgirl wrote, "The snow is falling on the cane fields." What if we were to learn from this girl child and reconcile the submerged history of the so-called Sir George Williams affair along similar lines? Kello's poem Sentences, that opens the volume, urges the reader to consider, quote, "The students that sit at the feet of cane stalks, sit at the feet of the enslaved, and learn that snow hisses down in sentences," unquote. What if the cane fields were burning in Montreal? Can brûlé. In other words, how might we take our cue from Brathwaite and Kello and locate Canada, not solely within a geography of snow, but rather an interconnected geography of fire, a network geography of the plantation system that hails transnational Black radicalism? I'll stop there.
Ronald, did you have a piece you wanted to read? Or,
Sure.
okay, go ahead.
A few years after Baldwin published The Fire That Time, American cities like Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore burned in civil rights protest and urban rebellion. In short, fire marks the potential for radical societal transformation and unprecedented change. Fire, however, does not always kindle hope. Within the long history of slavery, colonialism, oppression, fire has also been a weapon wielded by those who uphold white domination. Angelique, for instance, was sentenced to be burned alive, but upon appeal, was tortured and hung. Among the fighters for freedom in the Berbice Rebellion of 1763, 5 men were sentenced to death by slow fire, not only as punishment, but as a tortured warning to those who dared to consider revolt. The 1981 New Cross massacre in London, which occurred during the Thatcher era of anti-Black and anti-immigrant racism, was a targeted arson attack on a birthday party which took 14 young Black lives. This tragedy has been commemorated in verse by poets such as Linton Kwesi Johnson and J. Bernard. In Johnson's poem New Cross Massacre, the tragedy and terror of the time are captured in his reference to the fire over New Cross, casting the shadow of gloom over life. Bernard's collection, Surge, ends on a similarly gloomy note, repeating the question, will anybody speak of this, the fire we beheld? Yet the Black student protesters at Sir George Williams, despite the combustion of racism, exclusion, and violence they endured, believed institutions could change. The decolonial moment of the 1960s offered, as Audre Lorde reminds us, a wellspring of hope and energy. This, as Ronald Walcott and Idil Abdullahi insist, is the gift the protesters gave to Canada, the ability to think beyond the limitations of the nation and its institutions. Their vision was one that saw Canada as part of the imperial world, and thus a space where decolonization was possible. They brought with them on their geographies of migration, decolonial memories and analyses. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Again, so coming out of the two readings and when I reflect on a book, there's a contrast between fire and snow. And again, as a child, I remember growing up and we would put cotton on the Christmas tree to simulate snow when we didn't understand what it meant. So I can relate to coming to Canada, and so I get a sense that there's a contrast between this bringing fire to snow, and the picture that you painted, but also you made connections to other movements. So more than half a century later, we continue to grapple with the legacies of the recent watershed moments that's happened within the last 2 years, and George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, Ferguson, and so on. So and coming back to transnational Black radicalism routed through the Caribbean, what are the implications for neoliberal universities today and those contested spaces, because those issues still exist, and possibilities for some of these new movements? How are things, what do they look like then? How are they different today? And I don't know.
One of the things to think about, I mean, we do we do work in the neoliberal university. We're constantly reminded of that. But one of the things that this story teaches us are the ways in which campuses can be radicalizing spaces. They can be spaces where students find their voice, where they learn to speak up against oppression. And I think, embedded in that is a sort of potential for change. It's not coincidental that, the protest in 1969 was a student protest, right? And which became at the time Canada's largest anti-racist protest. And I think today we see a kind of a constant re-energizing of youth movements, and I think that's where some of the hope for change may lie. It's useful to think about what were some of those intergenerational conversations that were also happening in 1969, and to also think about that in the context of the present, to also think about the ways in which a sort of ongoing process of youth taking up the issues of the day, is important for societal change. And I think that's what we've seen in this particular moment, in some of the work around BLM and some of the conversations that have happened in the last couple of years.
I also think that one of the challenges in terms of activism is that each generation, has their own particular set of issues. The neoliberal university as it exists today wasn't what those students were facing in the 1960s, but it doesn't mean that we have to, reinvent the wheel each time, that there's something really important about listening to the struggles that came before us, because there was a massive movement that was built in the 60s. And through that process of occupying space, of claiming space, we have Black studies, we have critical ethnic studies. That's how those programs came to us and come and continue to feed us with their, as a source of power. But, there's also students from the 60s, from the Caribbean, brought with them their own kind of frameworks for analysis, as Ronald was pointing out. And that helped them to see the university, maybe, those of us who work in it, it's, we can become perhaps a little cynical of the university. But they saw education as having a radical potential for change. And that comes out of, the wider moment of decolonization. So that allowed them to see that when they were asking the professor, for example, to own up to discrimination in the grading practices, like what they were asking for was essentially inclusion, part of the language that the neoliberal university adopts in equity, diversity, inclusion as a kind of corporate branding. But what those students meant by inclusion might have meant something different, might have meant that, we were standing up one for all, that there's not going to be anybody left behind in this moment, and we need to come together collectively and to center, our community in this struggle to ensure that the university serves us. I think there's lessons there for us in the present.
And yes, and I'm going to say that I'm saying this for the first time, and this is kind of what resonated with me too in the book, was that back then what was called Ryerson, TMU, that we did suspect that there was one professor who was doing the same thing, and we did exchange assignments with another student, and I saw the difference in the grades. So but we didn't do anything about it. It was years later we were talking as alumni, to remember such and such a professor. So we'd experienced the same thing. So when I saw this, I thought, oh my gosh, I've never told anyone. So I'm saying this for the first time. So
yeah,
how would you describe the connections between Black power in the US and the struggles in Canada, and also Caribbean Black power, which was essential to the Sir George Floyd Williams occupation? So, and it's that transnational movement. So was there a connection, and how are they connected?
In multiple ways. One small way to begin to answer that question, because it really is a big question. In one of the chapters in the book, Rupert Lewis, who's a leading historian in the Caribbean, writes about letters that were exchanged between him and his sister, who was studying at Sir George Williams University at the time. You know, and that exchange of letters becomes one way in which, you know, there are these connections between all the places. But, you know, in reading the book, we also learn about, you know, the books that were exchanged across borders, were shared among young activists. And that becomes another way of thinking through some of those connections, some of those influences, some of the ways in which they were in dialogue, even when they weren't physically in the same place, right? They were reading some of the same things and being inspired by some of the same thinkers. I mean, we also think about in that moment, people like Walter Rodney were around, right? And that would be a sort of like space where they were thinking with you know, important figures like that. But also, one of the things that Rupert Lewis narrates in that chapter, you know, is one of the things he narrates are the parties that they had. And you know, we forget that, well, not that we forget, but it's important to remember that music was also part of their struggle. Music was also part of their revolution. And so the sounds that were coming out of the US in the 60s, James Brown singing "I'm Black and I'm Proud," you know, the sounds that were coming out of the Caribbean, you know, those were also part of the things that connected them. You know, so I think there's a lot that can be said about, you know, some of the political connections, but I do think that some of these other quotidian connections are also important to remember within this larger history. And I love that, you know, there are these stories that remind us of that, you know, in the context of this book.
And I just wanted to add, because I think Ronald is too modest, that his chapter on the Abeng newspapers, the student newspapers that Rupert Lewis and others produced in Jamaica, which also commented on the events in Canada, is really important, because Ronald draws for us the connections between past and present. So he was speaking about the ways in which literature circulated, the ways in which it was important to read, not just for academically to pass a test or something, but to the power of reading and discussing ideas in community and engaging with each other for social change. And he makes mention of the ways in which that, you know, we may have parallels with our marriage, with the way secret messages were passed through networks, you know, in service of liberation as well.
Oh, thank you. So I'm curious, what was the role of women in the occupation?
Ocean Jessor's chapter tackles that, and it's comes out of the 2019 Protests and Pedagogy event, where if some of the original protesters, including the women, in fact, there was a panel with 3 of the women protesters, one including Brenda Dash, who was facing a significant jail sentence and was considered one of the leaders, and was followed by CSIS and the CIA for many years afterwards, because she was deemed a Black radical. Herself, Yvonne Greer, Michelle Serrano, and then at another event we had Nancy Warner as well. So some of the women involved in the protest, who did not necessarily see their work as a feminist action. But there's something about, if you listen to their stories and then think about Caribbean feminism as a practice, there's something about that, again, to build on what Ronald was saying, there's something about the everydayness of, for example, Dorothy Wills, who's from Dominica, was a lawyer here at the time. She was not a student in '69, but she was a mother. And she, when the students were being arrested by the police on February 11th, 1969, she was not only standing outside keeping watch, but she went around with a bucket and asked community members to donate to the legal fund, because she knew that that's what they needed. So just like, what kind of everyday actions did those women take that maybe they didn't see themselves as feminist necessarily, but I think in the present generation, when we look at it, we can understand the kind of work of building community and building it in not only local community, but transnationally as well. That is, calling parents back in the Caribbean who might have been worried about the students being arrested, or Juanita Westmoreland, who is the first Black judge, woman judge in Quebec, and who defended the students at the trial, accompanied them back to Trinidad while she was pregnant, because the students feared what their parents might think of them. And so she was there to sort of explain it in a different light. So to take, those are all instances of feminist action that Ocean Jasor's chapter discusses.
Thank you. Is there a difference, different resonance between fiction and nonfiction narratives of protest?
Ronald?
I mean, maybe I'll say a little bit about the previous question as well, okay. Because one of the things for me is that question of what are the questions we're asking of the past, and of the archive. And I do think some of that work of feminist recuperation is about the questions that we ask, because women have always been central to Black protest, in multiple ways, and how do we ask the questions that then allow us to foreground those histories, and maybe in some ways we can think about how literature can be part of that in terms of reorienting the questions that we ask of the past and of the archive, and the ways in which we can think through the stories of individuals as a way of rethinking the archive and thinking about the relationships that are formed in the space of the sit-in. There have been a number of texts that have revisited the 1969 protest. Kai Kalau's stories in Dominoes at the Crossroads is one such text, so is H. Nigel Thomas's novel Behind the Face of Winter, which sort of looks back on that period to narrate the stories. And one of the things that those books do is that they allow us to think about the protesters, not in individual terms, but as sort of nestled within sort of families and communities. And I think that's also important to rethinking this history and the way in which we narrate this history.
And even though I'm not a literary scholar, I've learned from Ronald that there's a way in which poetry and prose gives us an imaginative way to connect the disparate parts, but that might not seem obviously connected. So I think it's important that we have that range of writing styles in the book.
So you talk about history, and earlier talk about this disappearance or a lack of having these stories in the Canadian consciousness. So apart from some of the obvious reasons, because there's so many other stories, even coming out of the stories of folks in the Windsor, Essex area and so on, and us trying to infuse an Afrocentric curriculum back, the missing curriculum. Why do you suppose that this story is not better known beyond this kind of ways in which we look at our histories and the erasure of our history? What is it about this particular story? And I know even the changing of the name of the university or the institution, and we seem to the story seems to get lost, but it's being told, as you say, in those spaces, but not in a mainstream Canadian consciousness. I've lived in Canada for 42 years. I never heard the story before.
Yeah.
I would say quite bluntly, because it's a shameful story. It's a story that, you know, if you were to engage with it seriously, demands a reckoning, right? We, as part of a follow-up to the 2019 protest and pedagogy event, we convened a conversation with Irene Shepherd, who's part of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, and Asanda Ngoshang, who was part of the Rhodes Must Fall movement. And it was kind of building on Afua Cooper's chapter in The Fire That Time, which gives us a chronology of Black history in Canada and builds the case, not just for this event, but within a longer context of why Canada owes reparations to the Black community. And I think that, you know, to read Afua Cooper's chapter is to be faced with the litany of events that demand a kind of truth and reconciliation, which I think Canada has avoided.
I guess in terms of thinking about resonances with the present, we begin our introduction thinking with Audre Lorde, you know, and her question about what it means to learn from the 60s. I mean, I think that question is still a relevant one. You know, I mean, it was such a pivotal time, just in terms of social movements, in terms of changes. And I think we can continue to learn from the 60s. And also just thinking through those strategies of protest, you know, the ways in which they were figuring out ways to challenge power, figuring out ways to do the daily work of decolonization. And I think we're in a moment where, you know, we need to think about strategies of decolonization again. And I think that's one of the things we can continue to learn from the 1960s.
Yeah, I mean, we were just so honored to be in conversation with people who were thinking about dismantling the harmful structures within the university, rather than, you know, simply or easily trying to assimilate within them.
Yeah. As an educator and looking at the book, I'm thinking about curriculum and kind of the big C curriculum, not just with what we do in the classroom, but in informal spaces or everything about what we teach and what we do and what we value and what we ignore. Where are the first places, or where are the most important places that you need to see this book getting into that is not right now? So I'm thinking universities, colleges, post-secondary, elementary, high school, communities, homes, and I know kind of all of the above, but how do we get the stories into those spaces? Have you thought about that?
Well, one of the things we're working on is to make this history more accessible. So we're working on a study guide so that teachers, say in the public school system, could think about some of the points raised in the book, but also where to go find other stories. You know, where are the Black archives? There's not necessarily these stories are not necessarily easy to find. They take, you know, for us, it took visiting with people, so sitting around the kitchen table, having coffee, them going into their basement and sort of digging up old newspapers. It takes sitting down and building trust and having genuine two-way conversations. All of that is part of what we're thinking will be drawn out in a study guide.
Okay. I do that. I do love that idea, and I'm thinking even now that that's going to change the ways that I teach and the stories that I tell to all of my students. And I work with kids from kindergarten all the way up to a PhD, and in making sure that history is not forgotten. Because there's a sense that if you don't tell these stories of resistance, then students don't learn about resistance. So there's no language of resistance. And I get the sense too that you're telling of the story was trying to preserve that history, as we said, but also giving this generation, or giving some validity to some of that language of resistance, and going all the way back to thinking back to my Caribbean education, that's all we knew. we knew resistance. So so is it, in a sense, in a way, and I guess it is, of validating that language or that culture of resistance, and I guess, you know, kind of playing on a metaphor of fire and flame. There was a flashpoint for Caribbean students, right? So all the right ingredients came together, and students pushed back in a way that was a part of their language and part of their culture, and part of the way that they saw that if there was injustice, they're going to speak out against it, right?
Yeah, I think we're also in a present moment where, you know, so like there's something that happens, like you know, had the fortune of growing up in the Caribbean. I didn't. So for me, like these histories were quite hidden, and I had to, you know, I really had to go seek them out and seek out community. Thankfully, I found that in my collaborative work with Ronald. And I think that we're in a moment where we see films like, for example, Our Dance of Revolution, which focuses on the histories of Black queer community protest in Toronto, building on a generation of people whose work in the 90s, like, you know, paved the way for future movements such as Black Lives Matter. And so we see, you know, people like, you know, we see elders like Makeda Silvera, for example, in that film, and which helps us, I think, for people who might not feel like they have a sense of family or community, that there's kinship being built in other ways. And I think turning to these histories, yes, is about a history of resistance. It's about knowing that your history doesn't just start in Canada, that there's something that connects you to other spaces. But it's also about how do we build community as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're at the end here. I'm not sure if we've gone over our hour, but let me do some, just want to thank you, Ronald and Nalini, just for your book, and again, it took me away from my regular work and got me, took me on a journey, connected with me in so many ways. So I appreciate that, and appreciate the conversation. I was looking forward to it the whole day today, all jazzed up for this. So thank you so much. for this and for the conversation. And I want to encourage folks who are watching this to go out and buy the book. That it's a worthwhile read. It's engaging. It's called The Fire That Time. It's Transnational Black Radicalism and the Sir George Williams Occupation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew, for your questions, for this conversation.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you for sharing some of your own experiences and memories with us as well. That I think really helps us put the book in a wider context. We appreciate that. And thank you so much to Irene Moore-Davis for inviting us to this conversation, and to the Windsor Book Festival for hosting us.
Thank you, Nalini, Mohabir, and Ronald Cummings, co-authors of The Fire That Time, Transnational Black Radicalism and the Sir George Williams Occupation. It's a book that everyone should read. Thank you, Andrew Allen, for your excellent moderation of this discussion. It was truly fascinating, and it was guided by wonderful questions. And we want to thank all of you for joining us. Stay tuned for news of BookFest, Festival du Livre Windsor 2023, which will be happening October 12th to 15th, 2023. Thank you.